Hello, welcome to the fifth segment of these lectures on globalization and free markets. I'm going to talk about the justice issues that are raised by free trade. As you recall from the last segment, Ricardo's law of comparative advantage showed that both countries, when they engage in trade, will gain in the aggregate. But it didn't say anything about the distribution of the gains from trade within the countries. There's another law called the various names, but the factor proportions law, which says, and here I'm quoting, the owners of a country's relatively abundant factors will gain from free trade, while the owners of a country's relatively scarce factors will lose. So when the two countries trade, the aggregate will go up, but it's not necessarily the case that everybody in the country will gain from the free trade. Well, in fact, there's an argument to say that not everybody will gain. There will be winners. There will be winners and losers when you have international free trade. Now, what's this law say? Relatively abundant factors will win, and relatively scarce factors will lose. What's relatively abundant? Well, here's two countries, home and away, and here's the total amount of capital in each country, and here's the total amount of labor in each country. As you will notice, away actually has more capital and more labor. But the ratio of capital to labor in home is higher, 50,000 per worker compared to 25,000 per worker. You can do the numbers. I hope I've got them correct. Whereas the ratio of labor to capital is 1 worker per 50,000, and here it's 2 workers per 50,000. So in this case, the relatively abundant factor is capital, because 50,000 here is bigger than 25,000 here. So the home is capital is its relatively abundant factor, whereas in terms of labor, it has only 1 worker per 50,000, whereas away has 2 workers for the same amount of capital. So home's labor in home is relatively scarce. Okay, so there's the scarce and there's the abundant factor for home. This will be the same for away. All right, so let me show you what the implications of that are. Here are the assumptions. I'm going to follow a discussion from Stolper and Samuelson in 1941. Paul Samuelson was an extremely famous economist of the late 20th century. So we've got two countries, home and away, and they produce clothing and automobiles, and they start to trade, international free trade in clothing and automobiles. Now, we're going to assume that manufacturing automobiles uses more capital than manufacturing clothing. Seems reasonable. Clothing production is therefore labor intensive, so let's say it takes 2 units of labor to produce 1 unit of capital, or 4 units of capital and 8 units of labor. Whereas automobile production is capital intensive, and in this case it's got 1 unit of labor and 1 unit of capital. Okay, so there's more capital per worker in automobile production than in clothing production. We're going to assume that a country has an advantage in producing goods that are intensive in the country's relatively abundant factor. That kind of makes sense. I mean, a country like Canada, say, which has lots of land, it has an advantage in producing food over countries, say, that have less land per person or per worker, like, say, China. Okay, so this is very plausible. I won't prove it here. I think this can be proved, and if you take an economics course in international trade, you'll find out how to do it. But we're not going. I think it's just plausible, and so I'm just going to assume it. Home's relatively abundant factor is capital. Its relative advantage, therefore, in automobiles, and home will start exporting automobiles and importing clothing on this model. Okay. Now, what happens in home when this goes on? Home is going to increase automobile production and decrease clothing production. Decreasing clothing production will release both labor and capital. Okay, so we imagine this being the factory that had 4 units of capital and 8 workers, 8 units of labor. Now these are all released, and at least to begin with, the workers are unhappy. Okay, 4 and 8. 4 and 8. So the problem is that decreased clothing production is going to release more labor than capital can take up in producing of automobiles. Because remember, it's 1-to-1 for automobiles and 2-to-1 for clothing. So we employ our 4 units of capital here, these guys, and we employ them in the production. They've released by decreased clothing production. We employ them in the production of automobiles. But in doing so, we only need 4 of these, the 4 units of capital only take 4 units of labor, leaving the people who are hired are happy, and the people who are not hired are left over, right? They're unhappy. There's now going to be too many workers for the amount of capital in home. This creates a surplus of labor and a shortage of capital, and then the normal laws of supply and demand are going to make it the case that in home wage rates will tend to fall because there's a surplus of people looking for jobs, and returns to capital will likely rise. There's no smile on the capital, but now we can see, if you like, that there's unemployed workers in home, and there are workers who are now working for less wages in this little model because because there's a surplus of labor, and the reserve army of the unemployed, as Marx would say, has increased, and it keeps wage rates down. So this is the factor proportions law. In home, the relatively abundant factor is capital. It returns to an increase, and the scarce factor is labor, and that falls. And in the other country, in a way, by a similar argument, the relatively abundant labor will be a winner, and capital will be a loser. Okay, so the 2 countries will be the opposite, and that'll always be the case, because unless they have the same, the same ratio of labor to capital in all their work, which is unlikely, there's going to be this effect. So generalizing, whenever there's differences in relative abundance of the factors, there's going to be winners, who are the owners of the relatively abundant factors, and there's going to be losers, who are the owners of the scarce factors. Okay, so this makes a difference from the point of view of distributive justice. Everybody gains from the utilitarian point of view, and that's good, right? Both countries gain, even as long as each has got a comparative advantage. They'll both gain, but what happens inside the country is not always going to be fair or whatever, because any sort of theory of justice generally is going to say that you shouldn't harm the least advantaged, the poorest people in the country, and as long as when the poorest people become losers, which they probably will be in one of those 2 countries, I'll show you some of what happens in just a second. Then that's not necessarily going to be a good thing. But don't forget that because the total pie is bigger in both countries, the winners can still compensate the people who have lost out and still be ahead of the game, as long as compensation is actually paid. The pie is bigger, so people can actually, it is possible for compensation to be arranged. It's just a question of whether it's actually done. And again, think of the theory of distributive justice that we've been employing mostly in this, thinking about in this course, which is Rawls's difference principle, says that the distribution everybody should get the same unless the least well-off receive more. And again, the emphasis on the least well-off, and if free trade impacts the least well-off, there's going to be a problem of distributive justice. So, and as I said, because of this factors proportion law, to summarize, there's going to be, because of factor proportions, there's going to be winners and losers, and because of Ricardo, the overall total quantity of goods in each country is going to be higher. So it is therefore possible, always, by these little models in economics at least, it is always possible for the winners to compensate the losers. Okay? Whether the compensation actually happens, that's an issue of domestic justice. Okay, let's look at a couple of these scenarios here. Here's a case of free trade in manufactured goods between India and the United States, which I talked about earlier. We've got two factors, unskilled labor and capital, and there was a relative abundance in India of labor, right, the relative abundant factor, and in USA the relatively abundant factor is going to be capital. USA tends to have more richer country. Okay, when they engage in free trade in manufactured goods, India is going to be a winner, and the unskilled labor in India is going to be a winner, and the capital in the United States is going to be a winner. Now let's think about these four groups. Unskilled labor in India, unskilled labor in the United States. It's a reasonable assumption that unskilled labor in India is going to actually be less well off than unskilled labor in the United States. Salaries will be lower. Okay, so they are the least well off. They're the least well off in India, and they're the least well off in both India and the United States. And they are going to be winners. So there's a prima facie argument here for free trade between India and the United States from a justice point of view. The least well off are going to win. There's going to be an issue in the United States, which is that unskilled labor are going to lose, and they're still within the United States. They're still the least well off, and but what we have is that the winners should compensate the losers in the United States. They don't need to compensate them in India, so this works out well. But in the United States, capital wins, labor loses. Again, because of Ricardo, the pie is bigger. At the end of free trade, the United States has more material goods, more manufactured goods than it had before. But the gains from this trade are going to go to capital, and labor is going to lose out unless there's compensation arranged. Here's another case, free trade in food between China and Canada. Let's look at these again. China, let's say, has factory labor and land, as does Canada. Let's assume that factory labor is fairly abundant, whereas its land is relatively abundant in Canada. Okay, seems a reasonable assumption. That means that in China, the factory labor is going to be a winner, and the people who work on the land are going to be losers, and it's going to be reversed in Canada. Farmers will be winners, and the laborers will be losers. But who's the most? Let's think now of how well off people are. In China, the factory labor is probably going to be wealthier than the peasants who work on the land. I'm just making this assumption for the sake of our example here, and I think this is because that's why so many peasants leave the land in China and move to the cities and work in factories. So the winners in China are going to be the better off. The losers are going to be the peasants. In Canada, the winners are going to be the landowners, who are the farmers, and they're probably better off than factory laborers. I mean, farmers, we complain, but they're still probably richer than most factory laborers. And the winners here are going to be the most advantaged. In both cases, the most advantaged are the winners. The losers are the least advantaged in both countries. And we've got a prima facie justice problem when we set up this free trade. Even though everybody overall, in the aggregate, China and Canada profit, we still need to arrange some sort of compensation to keep things fair, because it's not fair under most theories of justice to make people who are already badly off even worse off by your trade policy. So here's to summarize again. Free trade does generate winners and losers, and I tried to give you an outline of the argument why. Sometimes the losers were going to be the least advantaged. Okay, well that could be okay, because free trade also generates a larger aggregate pie which can be divided. But the issue is it can be divided, doesn't mean it will be divided. So the gains from trade make it possible for the winners to compensate the losers, and whenever the losers are the least advantaged. And justice requires that this happen. Another issue is the different mobility of the two, capital and labor. often the issues between capital and labor. See, capital is usually free to move across national borders, whereas labor is not mobile because of immigration. So when returns to capital fall in a country like away, the owners of capital can take their money and go to another country where they can get better returns. When the wages in home fall, workers cannot take their skills away to another country for better wages. So under the present structure of immigration law and agreements about capital transfers, there's an issue of fairness about the differential mobility. Okay, so pause the video and think about the following. Which of the following would be favored by a proponent of one of these egalitarian or democratic theories of global justice? So think about this for a second, and I will return. All right, it's not terribly hard. If the richest are winners, then the poorest are losers, and so this is not going to be the answer. The poorest are winners, that sounds good. The richest are losers, which means the poorest are the poor are winners. This is a possibility, okay? The poorest are losers, and the poorest are winners. That's not as good as where you can have this one. If the richest are, that means the poorest are winners, right? This isn't as good because the poorest are losers, and here they're winners, so that's not the answer. And the poorest in country P are losers. We don't want poor being losers by almost any theory of distributive justice. And the richest are winners, again, meaning the poorest are losers. So the best answer here would be B. All right, so to sum up, international trade from an economic utilitarian point of view that aggregates total goods and services produced is a great thing. And it's a great thing even when one country is more efficient than another in everything. The United States can trade with everybody. On the other hand, the process of opening up for free trade creates justice issues. The relatively abundant factor will win, and the relatively scarce factor will lose. And that can create problems of distributive justice that should also be considered along with the utilitarian aggregative principle. Okay, so don't forget, whenever you see a utilitarian argument, look to see if there's a justice issue, if there's a rights violation issue, or if maybe there's an issue that affects somebody's integrity and character. Okay, that's just utilitarian arguments often have these weaknesses.